At 1:54 a.m. on May 14, 2008, a desperate phone call shattered the silence of a Minnesota night. "Mom, Dad, I'm in trouble. I drove into a ditch." Those words would be among the last Brian and Annette Swanson would ever hear from their 19-year-old son, Brandon. What followed was a 47-minute phone conversation that would haunt investigators for over 16 years, ending with a single blood-curdling shout that cut through the darkness before the line went dead forever. The facts of that night seem straightforward enough. Brandon Swanson, a bright college student from Marshall, Minnesota, had been celebrating the end of his freshman year at two separate parties. But as investigators would soon discover, nothing about Brandon's disappearance was straightforward. The more they dug, the more questions emerged, and the more the rural farming community of Lincoln County began to harbor dark secrets. Brandon wasn't just any college student. Born on January 30th, 1989, in Marshall, located in southwestern Minnesota's Lincoln County, Brandon displayed exceptional intelligence from an early age. His parents, Brian and Annette, watched their son excel academically, becoming proficient in reading comprehension far quicker than his peers. His love for reading, science, and learning served him well through Marshall High School, from which he graduated in 2007. About 30 miles northwest of Marshall, in the town of Canby, Brandon enrolled at Minnesota West Community and Technical College. He was passionate about his science program, focusing specifically on wind turbines. His teachers would later describe him as academically successful and well-liked by everyone. During his time at college, Brandon lived with his parents in Marshall, commuting back and forth between the two towns daily. But Brandon had bigger dreams. Perhaps thinking he would have access to greater opportunities outside of rural Minnesota, Brandon made the decision to transfer to Iowa Western Community College in Council Bluffs, over 250 miles away from home. These plans would tragically never come to fruition. In May 2008, Brandon was 19 years old, and as his freshman year at Minnesota West had just concluded, he and his friends decided to celebrate with a night out. Brandon was in excellent spirits, having done well academically, and feeling excited about his upcoming transfer to Iowa. Their destination was Lind, about 8 miles southwest of Marshall, where a small house party was taking place. According to those who attended the gathering, Brandon was mostly seen hanging out with 5 or 6 people in the back garden. The event was fairly low-key and calm, quite different from some of the wilder parties happening in Canby that same night. Friends later stated that Brandon had consumed a few drinks at the party, though he showed no signs of impairment whatsoever. Brandon had also made plans to visit another friend before the night ended. This friend, much like Brandon, was planning to leave Lincoln County in search of more promising opportunities elsewhere. So, at approximately 11 p.m., Brandon got into his car and drove northward through Marshall, then up Route 68, as he normally would to reach Canby. This second party was also taking place in Canby, and Brandon arrived there around 11:30 p.m. From information gathered from friends at this second location, investigators learned that Brandon didn't stay very long. He had a drink or two before leaving around midnight to head home. Again, witnesses emphasized that he didn't appear impaired in any way. Here's where the story takes its first mysterious turn. To get to Canby, Brandon had driven along the major highway Route 68. However, to return to Marshall, he chose not to use the same route. Instead, he opted to travel down rural dirt and gravel back roads that ran parallel to Route 68. This decision would prove to be fatal. Why exactly Brandon chose this alternate route remains a subject of intense speculation. The prevailing theory among investigators is that he may have been concerned about encountering law enforcement on the main highway, which could have resulted in trouble given that he'd been drinking. However, this remains speculation, and it's entirely possible that some other factor influenced his decision. Brandon didn't have a GPS navigation system, and whether he was even familiar with these particular back roads is an open question. While this area wasn't too far from Marshall, it's unclear whether he would have had any previous reason to travel these routes instead of the familiar Route 68. Depending on how much he'd consumed that night, alcohol could have impaired his sense of direction. Additionally, Brandon was legally blind in his left eye, which certainly wouldn't have helped him navigate the absolutely pitch-black dirt and gravel roads illuminated only by his car's headlights. If Brandon had simply followed Route 68 home, he would have arrived well before 1 a.m., probably closer to 12:30. Instead, he found himself traveling on roads organized in a grid-like pattern, apparently attempting to drive back down to Marshall in a step-like fashion through the rural countryside. At precisely 1:54 a.m., Brian and Annette Swanson received the call that would change their lives forever. A disoriented Brandon was on the other end, explaining that he was in serious trouble. He'd accidentally driven his car off the road and into a ditch. Most puzzling of all, Brandon told his parents that he'd broken down somewhere between Marshall and Lind. Given that he had just left Canby, this location was virtually impossible. While it's not entirely clear why Brandon believed he was in this location, several theories have been proposed by investigators and amateur sleuths alike. First, and perhaps following Occam's razor, the alcohol may have affected Brandon more than anyone initially realized, leaving him disoriented and confused while driving. Second, given that the area would have been pitch black, he may have thought at some point that he'd crossed Route 68 and traveled too far south. Third, it's possible Brandon sustained some kind of head injury when his vehicle hit the ditch, which could explain his apparent confusion about his location. Perhaps most likely, investigators believe they're dealing with a combination of all three factors. If Brandon had sustained a head injury mixed with alcohol consumption, it's entirely possible he completely forgot that he'd even visited Canby, and genuinely thought he was trying to return to Marshall from Lind. Regardless of the cause of his confusion, his parents immediately sprang into action. Brian and Annette hurriedly got into their car and drove to the area between Lind and Marshall, but they couldn't locate Brandon anywhere. During the phone call, Brandon was flashing his headlights on and off, which his parents could hear clicking through the phone as they drove around the area. Obviously, they were unable to find him, because they were searching in completely the wrong location. What had actually happened was far more complex. Just before 1:15 a.m., Brandon had veered onto a maintenance road in an area approximately 25 miles from where his parents were searching. This particular dirt road connected two massive crop fields, though at the time they would have appeared completely empty since spring planting had not yet been completed. It's crucial to understand just how dark and disorienting this environment would have been for Brandon. The night was completely pitch black, and he was surrounded and engulfed by this overwhelming darkness. The land around him, though he wouldn't have been able to see much of it, was flat, empty, and vast in all directions, making it impossible for him to get his bearings or determine his location. At exactly 1:15 a.m., Brandon misjudged a turn, which sent his vehicle down into a steep decline in the ditch. He attempted to drive the car out, trying both forward and reverse, but the vehicle wouldn't budge. The incline was so steep that the wheels were no longer even touching solid ground, making escape impossible. Before contacting his parents, presumably because he thought involving them would land him in trouble, Brandon first attempted to call his friends. However, nobody was answering their phones at that late hour. Left with no other options, he finally called home. The phone conversation with his parents began at around 1:54 a.m., but frustration quickly set in. Brandon was having an extremely difficult time explaining his location, and his parents simply could not find him. As we now know, he wasn't even describing the correct area. At 2:17 a.m., Brandon hung up in frustration. Brian and Annette immediately called him back, and this time Brandon suggested they meet him in Lind, claiming he had a friend there who could help. Brian agreed to this plan and suggested they meet at the Linwood Lounge, where he'd picked Brandon up before. At this point, Brian drove Annette back home and then set off by himself to the lounge, where he sat waiting for his son, who would never arrive. At 2:35 a.m., Brandon called Brian again. This time, his description of his surroundings was more detailed and even more puzzling. Brandon told his father that he was standing in a field and could see fences around him. He also mentioned that he could hear the sound of rushing water close by, which Brian believed he could also hear through the phone. Most significantly, Brandon said he could see lights in the distance. He began walking toward these lights, convinced that he was seeing the town of Lind. As he walked, he continued describing the terrain to his father over the phone. Brandon seemed to believe he was walking along the golf course in Lind, but in reality, he was describing walking across empty farmland fields. This confusion makes perfect sense given the circumstances. Because the crops had not yet been planted, the farmland would have felt flat and open, very similar to how a golf course might feel in complete darkness. Brandon was actually traversing empty farmlands miles away from where he thought he was. The presence of running water seemed to confirm Brandon's belief that he was near Lind. The Redwood River runs directly through Lind and alongside the golf course, so both Brian and Brandon likely felt confident that Brandon was very close to safety. Unfortunately, this assumption would prove tragically incorrect. It remains unclear exactly what lights Brandon was seeing in the distance. Since he believed he was approaching Lind, it's uncertain whether these lights were stationary or moving. Investigators have theorized that he might have been catching glimpses of the towns of Taunton or Porter, or perhaps he was seeing the headlights of vehicles traveling on Route 68. The truth remains unknown. At approximately 3:10 a.m., after walking for over 30 minutes while maintaining phone contact with his father, Brandon suddenly shouted what Brian would later describe as an expletive or exclamation of surprise. The phone call abruptly went silent. Prior to this moment, Brandon had been walking and speaking normally to his father, showing no signs of distress or impairment. Brian immediately called out Brandon's name multiple times, but received no response. He ended the call and immediately began calling back repeatedly. Brian's thought process was logical. Perhaps Brandon had simply dropped his phone and couldn't locate it in the darkness. By calling the number, Brian hoped to light up the phone's screen and create noise, allowing Brandon to find it again. However, no matter how many times Brian called, each attempt followed the same pattern. The phone would ring for a while, then go to voicemail, indicating that the device was still functional and receiving signal, but nobody was answering. Upon hearing the shout, Brian later stated that he thought he might have heard Brandon slipping. However, he was careful to note that he didn't hear any splash or sound of someone falling into water. This detail would become crucial to the investigation. What happened in that final moment has become one of the most debated aspects of Brandon Swanson's disappearance. The fact that the phone remained functional and continued to ring suggests that whatever occurred, it didn't immediately damage or destroy the device. Yet Brandon never answered another call, never made contact again, and seemingly vanished into the Minnesota countryside without a trace. If you're finding this case as haunting and mysterious as thousands of others have, hit that subscribe button right now, because we're just getting started with the most puzzling aspects of Brandon's disappearance. The investigation that followed would uncover evidence so strange and contradictory that it challenges everything we think we know about missing person cases. After Brandon's chilling shout and the sudden silence that followed, Brian found himself in every parent's worst nightmare. The phone was still ringing when he called back, which meant it was functional and receiving signal, but his son was simply gone. At 6:30 a.m., approximately 3.5 hours after last hearing from Brandon, Brian and Annette realized their search efforts had failed completely. They needed professional help. What happened next reveals a disturbing flaw in how missing person cases are initially handled. When the frantic parents contacted law enforcement, their call was initially brushed off. They were told that at Brandon's age, he had the legal right to be missing, and they would need to wait 24 hours before filing a missing person report. Think about that for a moment. Here were parents explaining that their son had called for help, was stranded in a ditch, and then vanished mid-conversation after shouting in apparent distress, and the initial response was bureaucratic indifference. Fortunately, Brian and Annette refused to accept this response. They managed to bypass the initial dismissal by contacting the Lincoln County Sheriff directly. The sheriff, unlike the initial responders, immediately recognized that something serious had occurred. A search was organized and underway within 24 hours of Brandon's disappearance. Using Brandon's cell phone records, investigators were able to determine his last known location. The results shocked everyone involved. Brandon wasn't anywhere near Lind, as he'd believed. According to the phone company data, he was approximately 25 miles northwest of Marshall and about 20 miles away from Lind when he made that final call. This revelation stunned both the Swanson family and law enforcement, who were all astounded that he was so far from where he thought he was. Around 12:30 p.m. on May 14th, Brandon's car was finally located. The vehicle was found just off 390th Street, between the towns of Taunton and Porter. In addition to being roughly 11 miles southeast of his starting position in Canby, the crossroads where he'd left the road was only about 1 mile north of Route 68, the main highway he'd chosen to avoid. The discovery of the car provided some answers, but raised even more disturbing questions. The vehicle was stuck in a ditch so steep that the wheels weren't touching the ground, confirming Brandon's description of being unable to drive out. However, investigators found no footprints on the gravel roads, no tracks in the surrounding dirt, and no evidence indicating which direction Brandon might have traveled after abandoning his car. This is where the investigation takes a turn into truly bizarre territory. The Lincoln County Sheriff brought in highly trained search dog teams to track Brandon's scent from his vehicle. What these dogs discovered defies logical explanation and has fueled speculation for over 16 years. Initially, most of the search dogs couldn't pick up any scent trail at all, which was unusual given that Brandon had definitely been at that location. However, one dog, after being given some of Brandon's clothing to work with, suddenly picked up a trail. This dog set off from the vehicle, heading southbound down the road, then turned eastward toward the Yellow Medicine River. Here's where things become truly strange. Brian had mentioned during that final phone call that he thought he heard Brandon slip, though he was careful to note that he didn't hear any splash. When the search dog led investigators to the river, it seemed to confirm everyone's worst fears. Brandon had fallen into the water, and that was the end of the story. But then something happened that nobody expected. The dog didn't stop at the river. Instead, it continued tracking Brandon's scent. The dog exited from the river on the other side and kept following the trail. The scent led searchers to a gravel road, and from there to an abandoned farm property where the trail ended abruptly and completely. This evidence painted a picture that made no sense. If Brandon had fallen into the river and drowned, why was his scent continuing on the other side? If he'd gotten out of the river, why was he never found? And why did his trail end so suddenly at an abandoned farm? The river became the primary focus of the search operation. For 30 consecutive days, teams scoured the Yellow Medicine River without finding any evidence whatsoever. No clothing items surfaced, no personal belongings were discovered, and there was never any physical evidence suggesting Brandon had been in the water at all. This lack of evidence led Brandon's mother, Annette, to begin questioning the drowning theory. She argued that perhaps Brandon had indeed gotten out of the river, as the search dog evidence seemed to suggest. But if that were true, where was he? Investigators considered the possibility of foul play, but Sheriff Jack Vizecki stated there was simply no evidence supporting that theory. Even now, over 16 years after Brandon's disappearance, not a single article of his clothing has ever been discovered, and his cell phone was never located. One investigator proposed that Brandon might have tripped and dropped his phone that night, damaging it and causing it to fall into the water or causing the battery to disconnect. In this scenario, Brandon couldn't find his phone in the darkness, and as the night progressed, he became wet, cold, and exhausted, eventually wandering far from his car. However, this theory has a significant flaw. Brian stated that after Brandon's shout, he was still able to call the phone repeatedly, hearing it ring before going to voicemail. If the phone had been broken, submerged, or had lost its battery, it wouldn't have been ringing at all. It would have gone straight to voicemail. Some reports indicate that during the initial search, law enforcement was still able to make the phone ring, suggesting the device remained functional for some time after Brandon's disappearance. This could mean that Brandon had fallen into the river and was swept away to another location, or, alternatively, that he'd become even more disoriented in the pitch darkness and simply couldn't locate his phone. The weather conditions that night presented another serious concern. Temperatures were between 39 and 46 degrees Fahrenheit. If Brandon had gotten wet, hypothermia would have been a very real and immediate danger. Yet this still doesn't explain why his body was never recovered despite extensive searches. As the search progressed into the surrounding farmland, investigators encountered an unexpected and troubling obstacle. The Grand Forks Herald reported that many local farmers were adamantly opposed to allowing search dogs and search teams on their property. They claimed that search activities would scare their cattle, potentially resulting in financial losses. Many farmers demanded to see warrants before granting access to their land, but emergency support services were unable to obtain them. Some farmers argued that their properties were too far from where Brandon had vanished and didn't want to risk their crops being trampled or their livestock stressed for something they considered highly improbable. This resistance from local farmers has become one of the most controversial aspects of the case. Think about this situation from a parent's perspective. Your child has vanished without a trace, and people are refusing to let trained search teams look for him because they're worried about their cattle being startled. The moral implications of this stance have sparked heated debates in online communities for years. But here's where the speculation gets really intense and where some of the darkest theories about Brandon's fate begin to emerge. What if the farmers' reluctance to allow searches wasn't really about protecting livestock? What if someone knew exactly what happened to Brandon and was determined to prevent anyone from finding evidence? One theory that has gained significant traction online suggests that a local farmer might have been involved in Brandon's disappearance. Consider this possibility. Brandon is walking across what he thinks is a golf course, but is actually private farmland. In rural Minnesota, many farmers are extremely protective of their property, especially at night when they might assume anyone on their land is up to no good. Some farmers in remote areas are known to be paranoid about trespassers, either due to mental illness, drug use, or simply the isolated nature of rural life. These individuals often have what could be described as an itchy trigger finger when it comes to people they perceive as trespassing on their property. In this scenario, a farmer might have seen Brandon walking across his field in the middle of the night, assumed he was a trespasser with criminal intent, and shot him. Realizing what had happened, the farmer could have simply buried the body somewhere on his extensive property. This theory gains credibility when you consider how vast these farm properties are and how easy it would be to dispose of a body in such an environment. A farmer would know his land intimately, would have the equipment necessary for digging, and would have ample time to cover up any evidence. But the speculation doesn't stop there. Many online theorists argue that the farmer's refusal to allow searches becomes much more understandable if viewed through this lens. If you knew that Brandon's body was buried somewhere on farmland in the area, you'd certainly want to prevent any searches from taking place. One particularly chilling aspect of this theory involves the search dog that tracked Brandon's scent to an abandoned farm where the trail ended abruptly. What if that wasn't where Brandon's journey ended, but where his body was taken? What if someone found Brandon, either injured or dead, and moved him to a location where he'd never be found? Another angle to consider involves the possibility that Brandon did survive the initial incident but encountered someone with malicious intent. Picture this. Brandon, disoriented and possibly injured, stumbles onto someone's property in the middle of the night. Maybe this person was engaged in illegal activity they didn't want discovered. Maybe they were cooking methamphetamine, growing marijuana, or involved in some other criminal enterprise. In rural areas, people involved in illegal activities are often extremely paranoid about strangers, especially at night. If Brandon unknowingly stumbled upon something he wasn't supposed to see, someone might have felt they had no choice but to silence him permanently. The timing of Brandon's disappearance also raises questions. He vanished during planting season, when farmers would have been working their fields regularly. If someone had discovered a body on their property, they would have had numerous opportunities to dispose of it during normal farming activities. However, there's another perspective to consider, one that's more sympathetic to the farming community. Many people argue that not wanting to cooperate with police doesn't necessarily indicate guilt. Some rural residents have a deep-seated distrust of law enforcement and prefer to avoid any interaction with police, even if they're not doing anything wrong. These individuals might be engaged in minor violations, nothing serious, but significant enough that they don't want law enforcement poking around their property. In this mindset, even if they desperately wanted to help find Brandon, their ingrained distrust of police would prevent them from allowing searches. But here's what makes this case so frustrating for Brandon's supporters: the difference between not cooperating with law enforcement and not allowing anyone to search. If you genuinely wanted to help, but simply didn't trust police, wouldn't you search your own property? Wouldn't you allow private citizens with trained dogs to look around? If liability was truly the concern, or if the terrain was genuinely dangerous, wouldn't a property owner offer to accompany searches to ensure safety? The complete refusal to allow any searches whatsoever is what many find unforgivable and suspicious. Yet another theory focuses on the possibility that Brandon did find his way to that abandoned farm where the dog scent ended, but encountered someone who was using the property for illegal purposes. Abandoned farms are often used as locations for drug manufacturing, illegal dumping, or other criminal activities precisely because they're remote and supposedly unoccupied. If Brandon stumbled upon such an operation, particularly if he was disoriented and possibly injured, the people involved might have viewed him as a threat that needed to be eliminated. This would explain why his scent trail ended so abruptly at that location. There's also speculation about the nature of Brandon's shout during that final phone call. His father described it as an expletive or exclamation. But what exactly did Brandon see or experience in that moment? Was it surprise, fear, pain, or something else entirely? Some theorists argue that the shout sounded like someone who had suddenly encountered another person. If Brandon had been walking alone across what he thought was empty farmland and suddenly came face to face with someone, his reaction might very well have been a surprised shout. The fact that the phone call ended abruptly immediately after the shout is also telling. If Brandon had simply fallen into water or gotten injured, you might expect to hear some additional sounds, struggling, splashing, or continued conversation. The sudden, complete silence suggests that whatever happened occurred quickly and decisively. One of the most haunting aspects of this case is how close Brandon seemed to be to safety. He could see lights in the distance and was walking toward what he believed was the town of Lind. If his sense of direction had been just slightly better, if he'd chosen a different route home, if he'd simply stayed with his car and waited for help, he might be alive today. The geographic layout of the area adds another layer of mystery. Brandon was found to be much closer to major roads and inhabited areas than initially believed. Yet despite extensive searches, involving hundreds of volunteers, aircraft, and specialized equipment, not a trace of him has ever been discovered. This case has become a rallying cry for missing person advocacy groups who point to it as an example of how critical the first few hours are in a disappearance. The initial dismissive response from law enforcement, while ultimately overcome, may have cost precious time during which Brandon might still have been alive and in need of rescue. Brandon Swanson's disappearance remains one of Minnesota's most perplexing, unsolved cases. Over 16 years have passed, and despite thousands of hours of searching, advanced technology, and the dedication of his family, Brandon seems to have vanished completely from the earth. The case has inspired Minnesota's Brandon Act, which requires law enforcement to immediately begin investigating missing person reports regardless of the missing person's age, eliminating the arbitrary waiting periods that initially hampered the search for Brandon. But for Brian and Annette Swanson, no legislation can bring back their son or answer the questions that haunt them every day. What happened during those final moments of the phone call? Why did Brandon shout? Where is his body? And perhaps most importantly, did someone in that rural farming community know more than they were willing to share? If this case has gripped you the way it has thousands of others, make sure you're subscribed because missing person cases like Brandon's need our attention to keep them in the public eye. Share this story, discuss it with others, and never let Brandon Swanson be forgotten. The truth is out there, buried somewhere in those Minnesota farm fields, waiting to be discovered. Until that day comes, Brandon's family continues to search, to hope, and to demand answers from a community that may be hiding the most devastating secret of all.